All right, we're back live with you tonight here on In Focus. Let's turn to this now. The South African Communist Party is calling for the prosecution of those implicated in currency manipulation. This after a second bank recently admitted to fixing the rand-dollar exchange between 2007 and 2013. The Competition Commission claims 28 banks were involved. SACP spokesperson Dr. Alex Mashilo joins us now for more on their call. Dr. Alex, good to have you, and thank you very much for your time. You know the question that always comes when SACP comes on board and talks about these issues. One is, where was the SACP when 28 banks were manipulating the rand? Were you under a rock? Why are you calling for harsher actions now?
No, we were not under the rock. You will notice that in our statement, we give you the history of the matter, where the matter comes from. And this is not the first statement and the first action we have taken. You will recall that the SACP is the leading organization in South Africa on financial sector transformation. So that's where we were. But this manipulation, as the banks, some of the banks argued, took place in the United States, in New York. Because when the Competition Commission took them to the Competition Tribunal, they argued that the Competition Commission and the South African courts do not have jurisdiction over the matter because their activities happened in New York, the United States. This is what led to, among others, the court ruling that the Competition Commission must revise the charge sheet and focus on, among others, the impact of the actions by the banks in South Africa. Because it doesn't matter where it happened. What matters is that they manipulated the South African currency, and in doing so, they, through their actions, impacted on the people and the economy, as well as the state revenue of South Africa.
Mm. One listening to that would say that sounds a little bit like what we were hearing maybe back in 2016 when former President Jacob Zuma was saying there is a third force hell-bent on creating havoc in the South African economy, almost saying that there could have been a third force that would have been operating outside of the country to create havoc in the country. To what benefit?
No. Look, there are different conditions. You will know that we had a rent crisis in 1998. We also had a rent crisis in 2001. And the background to that crisis, if I may use that word, was South Africa liberalizing the financial markets, allowing the rent to flow, and powerful forces in financial and currency markets to determine the rand exchange rate. In other words, less involvement of the state in determining the rand exchange rate. And of course, in doing so, or if the state was to be more involved, more resources would be required. But a greater amount of resources will be required depending on the legal and legislative framework. If I were to give you an example, you cannot wake up and manipulate the Chinese currency. There are so many mechanisms and legislative frameworks that protect it. So the state exercises authority there. So in South Africa, the line that the South African state chose, allowing those forces or paving the way for those forces to do what they do, was in 1996 under Gear, when they abolished the financial rents, liberalized the currency and the financial markets, and liberalized even the capital account, referring to cross-border financial transactions. So it is true that there were forces, and these forces are more than the 28 banks, because remember, in 2020, the Competition Commission added 3 more banks that took part in manipulating the dollar rand pair rate. And as a result, you have about 28 plus 3, that's about 31 banks that were involved in manipulating the rand exchange rate. And as a result of that manipulation, what would have happened when a currency is attacked is that that currency experiences devaluation. And because of that devaluation, goods such as oils that we depend on and are imported become more expensive for the country because we do not buy oil directly. We buy US dollars and we make use of the US dollars to buy the rand. So when the currency depreciates, what happens is that we spend more in rand to buy the same commodity. So this is what these banks have done. So, and that has increased prices in South Africa. It has increased the state debt servicing costs because if you have the debt like we do that we pay in dollars and the interest rates are not fixed, every time the rand depreciates, your debt burden increases. So these banks have had far more impact on the economy of South Africa, including retrenchment, because you would have seen the Reserve Bank responding to these changes in the economy, especially prices, by raising interest rates. Yeah. So when interest rates increase, they discourage people who have factories who want to expand their productive capacity from borrowing as the cost of capital is too high. So the impact of this bank has been long-lasting, and it includes the contribution to South Africa's sustained high unemployment rate.
So let me understand you clearly. I mean, are you saying that the ministers of finance were turning a blind eye to this manipulation when they saw it clearly happening? Because you remember in 2019, I think it was Tito Mboweni who said at the time Treasury has no evidence of rand manipulation by the banks. Well, now we know that the banks are coming up and giving us the evidence.
Yeah, but you need to look at these banks. I'm afraid of saying this. I think you must look at these banks and check if the Minister of Finance you are talking about has got no relationship to one of them. And I slowed down in saying so. It is easy for you to check. You just go to the internet, you check who sits on the board of these banks. It is possible that you may find one of these banks that he would have served in previously before he became the Minister of Finance, and that he would have returned to after he became the Minister of Finance. I'm not saying it is so. I'm saying it is possible. I suggest you start with JP Morgan and Chase when you do your search. But the point I am raising is that the ministers of finance, in campaigning for liberalization of our finance and currency markets, and previously for the banks to be exempted from the Competition Commission, which demand South Africa did not accept. To some extent, the framework, the financial framework that they promoted, enabled the banks to do what they have done. And this is not their action. It's a matter of a framework, because the framework is not adopted by the ministers of finance only. It becomes state policy. So it is important that South Africa must take a step back and ask this question. As a country that has got a sovereign currency, do we sit back in determining the exchange rate of our currency, or do we intervene in the determination of the exchange rate of our currency? And sitting back will mean that you allow other forces to determine it. And as we have seen, other forces will determine it through manipulation, as these banks have done. And by the way, the Competition Commission's intervention happens after what happens. It's like water under the bridge. So you take these banks and you fine them, for example, 10% of their annual turnover. But if the legal framework that allowed these banks to manipulate the rand persists, therefore, it is possible that even after 2013, other banks or financial traders could have manipulated the value of the rand. Let me give you an example. When the hysterical United States ambassador to South Africa, Dr. Robin Brichetti, made the allegations that he recently made, leading to President Ramaphosa establishing a commission, the rand lost its value within hours, massive amounts, to a point where when the president announced that he received the report of that commission, he acknowledged that the behavior of that ambassador impacted negatively on South Africa and its finances. But if you have policies like exchange rate controls, if you tightly regulate, for example, also it is something else, this one, your capital account, and if you put in stronger regulatory measures to prevent third forces from manipulating, because here you are not talking about third forces. The banks are our central bank's monetary policy transmission. When the governor of the Reserve Bank announces interest rate increases, that decision is transmitted via the bank to the consumers and companies in the economy. You are talking about active forces here. So you are not talking about some unknown third forces. You are talking about well-known forces. South African banks, multinational banks, headquartered in the US, in Britain, in France, in Australia, and so on. So while the action by the Competition Commission to hold them to account is important, we need regulatory and legislative measures that will make it impossible for the banks in future or any other financial or currency trader to manipulate our currency.
So the Reserve Bank governor believing that the Competition Commission is the right institution to probe these allegations of market abuse, saying their 8-year case against the 28 banks shows really the kind of capacity and strength that is in that bank, saying that that is in that institution, saying the bank itself conducted its own investigation at the time, but the commission is the more competent authority on allegations of market abuse and the process that should take effect thereafter.
Okay, what he did not say is that in an economy, the Reserve Bank is the most appropriate institution that has to intervene on behalf of a state in the exchange rate of the currency of that state. That is not the task of the Competition Commission. He is correct insofar as he refers to the role of the Competition Commission.
Yeah.
But the Reserve Bank is responsible for monetary policy.
Yeah.
And exchange rate policy is part of monetary policy and falls squarely under the competency of the Reserve Bank. But I must say that for the Reserve Bank to act, it also depends on monetary policy, because the Reserve Bank, although when sometimes we talk about interest rates, we refer to them as monetary policy. Mostly the Reserve Bank enters the scene through monetary policy conduct, while the Treasury sets monetary policy. In terms of our constitution, which sets up the South African Reserve Bank as the central bank of the Republic, the powers and functions of the Reserve Bank, that is, in one word, the mandate of the Reserve Bank, is set through an act of Parliament. So Parliament also has a role to play, because its role in terms of the Constitution is to set the powers and functions of the central bank. And at the policy level, The National Treasury, in terms of the Public Finance Management Act, is responsible for coordinating our macroeconomic policy. In performing its functions, according to the Constitution, the Reserve Bank must regularly consult with the minister responsible for finance in the Republic. So you are talking about Parliament, you are talking about the executive authority. In this case, in terms of the Public Finance Management Act and the Constitution as represented by the Minister of Finance. And you are talking about matters relating to exchange rate policy or conduct of monetary policy, which in terms of our framework belong to the Reserve Bank. When the Competition Commission comes into the picture, it comes when things have happened, like it has come when the rand has been manipulated. Although we need stronger competition laws that can prevent this, but competition laws alone are not going to be enough. We need a monetary policy framework that also helps defend South Africa against currency attacks.
I want you to expand a little bit on that. One of the recommendations, for example, from the Reserve Bank report when they conducted their own investigation in 2014, they published on their website that they recommend that a code of conduct be developed for the forex market. Is that what you're calling for? Something slightly a little bit more than that?
They are right. That is one thing that has to happen. But we need to go beyond that. We need legislative changes. Let me give you an example. After the post-1996 liberalization of the finance and currency market, by the way, it started around 1995 with the abolition of the financial rand. And by 1998, massive advances in liberalizations have happened in trade and financial markets, but they continued. So when they reached their zenith around the 2000 and 2001, we experienced the 2001 rand crisis. That was a massive depreciation of the rand. And what happened is that the executive, the cabinet, led by former President Thabo Mbeki, appointed a judicial commission to investigate. If you read the report of that judicial commission, there is a commissioner who broke away from the rest of the other commissioners, because that commissioner, if you were to analyze it from a progressive perspective, that commissioner was progressive. The others were concerned on whether there was illegal conduct or unlawful conduct. That commissioner disagreed and said, no, look, even if you can say your focus is on unlawful conduct and so on, we need to focus on the regulatory and legislative framework that enabled this massive capital flight, because the rent crisis came as a result of a massive capital flight. And what enabled that massive capital flight were legislative changes, and we are still within the framework of those legislative changes. So the question that South Africa has to ask is whether as a state it must fold its arms and watch its rand, or the exchange value of the rand determined by market forces without the state playing in that space. And if the state was to play into that space, what exactly will the state do? The code of conduct is one thing. It is important, it will be welcome. But we need legislative changes, we need more regulatory changes, and we need an activist Reserve Bank that sees it as its duty to defend the rand. I will emphasize why I'm saying this. The Reserve Bank has this policy, the narrow policy of inflation targeting. Now, when yourself, Thabo, and 31 of your friends or 32 of your friends attack the rand, resulting in the depreciation of the rand, you are compelling South Africa to spend more on buying oil. That results in increases in the price of petrol and diesel, which are key inputs in production and transportation. You cannot have a Reserve Bank that folds its arm and waits to increase interest rates when that happens, hurting the economy. Look at the South African economy. It is unable to resolve the crisis of unemployment poverty and inequality. This economy is has been deindustrializing for a long time. In terms of some recent report released this year by Statistics South Africa, the contribution of manufacturing to both the country's gross domestic product and employment has dwindled. It has dwindled. So it is time we look at the entire framework, including the role of the Reserve Bank. But we are not isolating the Reserve Bank. We don't need the Reserve Bank to stand aloof from the processes that determine the currency exchange rate and later influence inflation. And the only way it can respond is to increase interest rates. If you look at the 10 interest rates that the Reserve Bank, if you look at the 10 interest rate increases that the Reserve Bank imposed since November 2020, I'm telling you, Tabo, just go and look at your mortgage bond statement. Compare the amount of money that you paid before the consecutive 10 interest rates increases and the amount of money that you are paying now. I put it to you that that money does not go into your essential needs. It is also not going into paying your property. That money is purely going into interest rates. That is unfair.
Yeah. So when you look at the functions of the Reserve Bank, none of that, and the Reserve Bank governor will tell you as well that we have nothing to do with currency. The things that we do really is inflation targeting. We are issuing of banknotes and coins here and there, acting as a banker to the government, acting as a bank of other banks, providing facilities for clearing and settlements of claims. You know the list. None of that has got to do with currency.
No. Issuing banknotes and coining the coins. That's our currency. Banknotes and the coins that you have are our currency. And when some people attack our currency and inflation increases, that's a currency problem. Because in terms of the South African Constitution, I don't think that the Reserve Bank governor will argue that. You know why? Because the South African Constitution says the primary object of the South African Reserve Bank is to protect the value of our currency. Now, when the value of our currency is attacked and the rand depreciates, where is the Reserve Bank, which the Constitution says has as its primary object to protect the value of this currency? Where is it and what has it done?
Dr. Alex Mashilo?
That's the question that must worry the Reserve Bank governor. And it is a constitutional question. The primary object of the Reserve Bank as the central bank of the Republic is to protect the value of our currency. And the value of our currency came under attack. And the attack resulted in the value of the currency depreciating. What did the Reserve Bank do to protect the value of our currency in that situation?
Dr. Alex Mashilo.
Because you cannot tell me that increasing interest rates is the only instrument of protecting our currency. And when 31 banks come together for 5, 6, 7 years consecutively attack the value of the currency, you are not there to protect it. It can't be. That will be unconstitutional.
We appreciate your time. Let's leave it there. Thank you very much for coming on SACP's Dr. Alex Mashilo and their call for stronger actions to clamp down on the currency exchange rate manipulation.